Welcome, everyone, to Fantasy Foresight, the podcast. We're your hosts and co-founders of FantasyForesight.com, coming to you from the Rambo Fixture Company studios. I'm Ben.
And I'm Jay.
You ready to get rolling, Jay?
You know it. Let's do this.
All right, let's go. Welcome in, everyone. It is Wednesday, May 1st, and we've got the wide receivers and tight ends for the NFC South in what will be our last review episode of 2018 before we start to turn all of our attention and all of our focus on 2019. How you doing tonight, Jay?
Oh, Ben, you said it all, my friend. This is the final review episode from the 2018 season. It's May 1st. The winds of spring are blowing in warmer temperatures, and the winds of change are blowing over NFL rosters. So I cannot wait to dive into the results from the draft, see how rosters are going to be impacted heading into the 2019 season. But before we do that, we need to learn our final lessons from 2018. And what we have for you now are the wide receivers and tight ends from the NFC South, starting with the tight ends so we can end this on a positive note with some interesting wide receivers, Ben.
Yes, sir. So let's start us off with the New Orleans Saints tight ends. We had Ben Watson and newcomer for 2019, Jared Cook. Coming into the season, Ben Watson, we really liked his 2017 performance in Baltimore when he was coming off an injury from the year before that. That combined with his return to New Orleans and a QB upgrade going back to Drew Brees instead of Joe Flacco had us really liking him as a sleeper coming into 2018. We had him as tight end 9 coming into the season. He was undrafted. Mike Clay had him as undrafted, and they were all right. Jay, he finished as tight end 21.
But look, what we've been doing ever since Jimmy Graham left the Saints is waiting for that replacement to step in and be an elite tight end for the Saints offense, and it just has never come to fruition. It didn't happen with Ben Watson. Like you said, he's going undrafted in drafts heading into this season. I can't blame him there. Why? They bring in Jared Cook. We've discussed him to a point. He was one of the bigger surprises in the fantasy season last year, finishing as tight end 5, and he is currently going 75 overall as tight end 8. Again, the expectation is there for the Saints to have an elite tight end. They need someone to catch some passes outside of Alvin Kamara and Michael Thomas, but I don't know, man.
Here's what I know. In 2017 with Derek Carr, he managed tight end 12 numbers. In 2018 with Derek Carr, he managed tight end 5 numbers. So my question to you is, in 2019, hitting that massive upgrade button to Drew Brees, what is he going to be in the realm of fantasy in comparison to his current tight end 8 price tag?
Well, I'll tell you what, he's going around a very interesting group with Evan Ingram, Hunter Henry, Vance McDonald, and David Njoku. I mean, there's some interesting names there. Hunter Henry coming off of injury, but really Evan Ingram, he's in for maybe an increase in target share. And then you have Vance McDonald, we've covered him, and David Njoku in a high-flying offense with a lot of mouths to feed. So, I mean, that is an interesting group, Ben.
It really is. I had in my notes that I expected his ADP price to go up, but then when you look at all the other names going around him, I don't expect the hype train to lessen for any of them either. Right. So maybe it won't. And I'll tell you what, finishing tight end 12 and tight end 5 in the Raiders offense of the past 2 years compared to the Saints offense, I think I would be very, very comfortable with Jared Cook if he stayed at that tight end 8 price tag.
Well, maybe he'll finish where we expected Ben Watson to finish last season, right around tight end 8, tight end 9.
No kidding, man. So moving on to our next group of tight ends, we got a pretty interesting group in Tampa Bay with O.J. Howard and Cameron Brate.
A lot of debate about who was going to be the lead dog between these two heading into the 2018 season. Cameron Brate was the one who got paid in the offseason. O.J. Howard, we thought he looked strong in the preseason. He was our pick amongst the two tight ends on this team coming into 2018. Now, going into the season, we didn't have a lot to go on as far as what to expect from him. Total Foresight had him ranked as tight end 33. Mike Clay did not have him ranked in his preseason rankings, and overall he finished tight end 14, just outside a tight end 1 in a wacky tight end season, but a high end tight end 2. So what I take from that, what were you going to say, Ben?
I was going to say, and that's largely due to the fact that he played 10 games, because he finished as tight end 6 in fantasy points per game.
That's a good point. Yeah, I'm glad you bring that up. He played 14 games in year 1. he played just 10 games in year 2. And that's something that you're going to have to factor in with O.J. Howard going into 2019. And on the same note, we're talking about this talented tight end group that the Bucks have. Cameron Brate had off-season hip injury as he was nursing an injury all season long that we didn't really know about. You could tell he wasn't right. He wasn't very impactful. He finished as tight end 19 overall, so behind O.J. Howard, and we had him ranked actually as tight end 16 in total foresight, so we really had him tabbed, even though he admitted that he wasn't himself last season.
Right, and you make a great point going back to O.J. Howard about his injuries, and I know that Cameron Brate's not healthy right now. Assuming that his offseason surgery got him right, he becomes a really interesting option if O.J. Howard were to go down from injury, but history tells us that he is likely to miss a couple games a season. But on the other hand, his upside is very real. Minimum 30 receptions. He was tight end 1 with 16.6 yards per catch, and the tight end yards per catch leader, minimum 30 receptions in each of the last 2 seasons.
Okay, at the end of the day, here's what I know about these 2 tight ends. Cameron Brate, we had him tabbed in total foresight. We picked him as tight end 16. He finished tight end 19. You and I going into the season, we liked O.J. Howard better. He finished better than Cameron Brate. He finished tight end 14. Cameron Brate finished tight end 19. Fact, win, done.
I'll take it. Yeah. And going forward, if he is right now in way too early ADP, he is being drafted, Jay, as tight end 5, 63 overall behind Kittle and Eric Ebron and in front of Evan Ingram and Hunter Henry.
Okay, so, hit the brakes. Now
I was just going to say, now we got a conversation because I knew you weren't seeing that part.
No, listen, man. This offense, we just told you how it's a down year for the tight end position, and neither of these guys were able to crack the top 12 in the tight end position. And now you're asking me to pay tight end 5 price on this, and that's too rich for me, but that's something we can cover in the preview podcast, because these 2 guys, I mean, there's going to be some more debate about it going into the season.
Well, real briefly, the pros are that crazy yards per catch rate that I told you about and Bruce Arians. The cons are the injury concerns and his quarterback, Jameis Winston, and it's as simple as that, and it depends on which side of the coin you're on. And like you said, topics for future podcasts.
Absolutely. All right, now let's get to Austin Hooper in Atlanta. Verbatim from our preseason notes. Big and quiet improvement from year 1 to year 2. Might he take another unexpected step this year? Now, in total foresight, we had him ranked as tight end 22. He was not ranked in Mike Clay's draft. He was going undrafted in drafts heading into the season. And where did he finish, Ben? One of the bigger surprises of the 2018 fantasy campaign. He finished tight end 6 and tight end 8 in points per game.
Yeah, and he played all 16 games, which we love.
Absolutely.
And also, we talked about him in the preseason podcast, and we really liked him as a sleeper type. Even though he was going for free, we were talking about being somebody that you could really return some pretty good value very late or even for free in your drafts. And like you said, he finished as tight end 6 overall, tight end 8 points per game, tight end 8 with 88 targets, tight end 4 with 71 receptions, tight end 7 with 660 yards, and tied for tight end 9 with 4 touchdowns.
Dude.
Now, I think all those numbers are completely sustainable, even if Matt Ryan has a potential down year adjusting to a new offense like we alluded to. And we'll get to Julio Jones in a little bit. We think it might impact him as well. But when Austin Hooper's yards per catch is 9.3 and he is making hay off of 70 catches for 660 yards, I don't think it's going to be very difficult for him to repeat that performance or even best it.
No, you're absolutely right. I completely agree with you. And those numbers equated to a very consistent and reliable tight end 1 during the 2018 campaign. And I'm with you. Those numbers should not be hard for him to match or eclipse in 2019. And then you add into the fact that he's going 101 overall currently in early drafts and tight end 11. And we just talked about O.J. Howard, who finished tight end 14, is going as tight end 5.
Exactly. Bingo. And that's the thing to discuss about him right now. If his price tag continues to be as low as tight end 11, he is somebody that I will wait on all day. He's going ahead of Delaney Walker, ouchie. Trey Burton, I'm still not convinced.
Touchdown dependent.
Exactly. Going right behind Vance McDonald and David Njoku. We have a lot of confidence in both of those guys. But again, if you want to talk about the max value type plays, Austin Hooper is one of those guys for me currently going tight end 11. left.
Listen, man, I mean, if you look at those offenses, Pittsburgh, you have Cleveland, which should be a revamped offense, and then you have Atlanta, a proven offense in the fantasy worlds. And then you take a look at Delaney Walker and the guys who are going behind him, and I feel like there's a clear separation there from the top tier of tight ends and then everybody else. And yeah, I love his value heading into 2019.
Yeah, his floor is rock solid, and his ceiling I don't think has been achieved yet. And it'll be a fun one to discuss going into next season. And it'll be a fun price tag to watch as this offseason unfolds.
Let's talk more about Austin Hooper, because I don't want to get to our next guy. It just makes me sad.
Well, you got to do it anyways. Carolina Panthers tight end Greg Olsen.
Poor Greg Olsen. Our guy for so long, like a decade, man. He was our guy. Heading into 2018, he had, to that point in his career, his first ever truly limited season due to injury, finishing as tight end 27 in 2017. But due to his career sample size prior to that, we thought tight end 5 was a fair price at that time, in that it was more likely than not that he'd return to form. Now, Total Foresight, on the other hand, had him ranked as tight end 21, compared to Mike Clay and a lot of other rankings having him around tight end 4, tight end 5. He was being drafted as tight end 5. Where did he finish? He finished tight end 25, tight end 17 in PPR points per game. So exactly where Fantasy Foresight and Total Foresight had him pegged.
And you know why that was, Jay? It was because he had a statistical blip on the radar previous season due to injury. So Total Foresight, the cold hard truth, takes that into consideration next season. And what happens, he finishes exactly where we thought, and partially due to the injury risk.
And there it is.
And he only played 9 games.
I feel like we need to talk about Total Foresight more often. It takes into historical data what they've actually done on the field. It takes into health. It takes into projections. It takes everything to give you an overall picture of what you can expect from a player. Is it always 100%? No, but it gives you the most realistic vision of what to expect from a player, and it nailed Greg Olsen because it took all that risk into account. It took what he had done in his past, and I mean, it was there. And unfortunately for Greg, it just was not a fantasy relevant season.
Exactly, and he didn't have a single tight end 1 statistic other than having 4 touchdowns. He was tied for tight end 9 with 4 touchdowns. Yeah. He didn't even have 300 receiving yards, didn't even have 30 catches, didn't even have 40 targets. And right now, in way too early ADP, he's going as tight end 21, 178 overall, only in front of Jimmy Graham. I'm going with Jimmy Graham and A-Rod's offense. We've already covered him. Man, yeah, we've got one more tight end to briefly mention in this division, and that's Ian Thomas. He wasn't on our preseason radar. He wasn't on anybody else's preseason radar. He finishes tight end 24 overall, tight end 34 in points per game, played all 16 games, which we like. He was only really relevant in the last 4 weeks of the fantasy season. Yep. 3 of the 4 weeks to be exact, because week 15, he was still irrelevant in fantasy. But for some reason, week 13, he's tight end 12. Week 14, he's tight end 5. And week 16, he's tight end 8. So he proved he's capable. We're pretty unsure about Greg Olsen's retirement status at this point. Regardless of whether or not he comes back, I don't expect him to be anything relevant. And I don't know that he's going to be able to stay on the field, quite frankly. And Ian Thomas will become a very interesting option if he is indeed the last man standing at that tight end position.
Yeah, currently going undrafted in standard drafts, but I have seen him going in deeper drafts. So yeah, I mean, an interesting proposition in that offense with possibly limited targets. But speaking of targets, let's flip it over to the wide receiver side of this team.
Thank God.
No kidding. All right. We're going to kick this off. Let's kick this off with Curtis Samuel. Now, Curtis Samuel had a tough rookie season. He was banged up for a large part of the season, wasn't really fully ingrained into that offense, so we didn't know what to expect coming into year 2, and really nobody else did. You know, a guy in that position can go one of 2 ways. He just can't get healthy and he ends up flaming out, or he's able to get right, he's able to make the most of the limited opportunities he's able to get early on, and then he runs away with it. And Curtis Samuel, to his credit, did the latter part. He finished as a top 50 wide receiver in fantasy land, WR 49 squeaked in there, WR 46 in points per game, And really, I remember our podcast late in the season, Ben, he was having a nice clip later in the season, so he really did come on. And that has led to him going as WR58 in drafts heading into 2019 at 167 overall. What say you, my friend?
I mean, I do remember that he came on at the end of the season. I remember that Cam was struggling with injury. There's just something about the pass catchers with Cam Newton, other than Greg Olsen, that I've historically just not really felt too comfortable about. Robert Foster, I think he had something like 20 yards per catch. I really like at that point in the draft, I love that explosiveness. Dante Moncrief is competing with James Washington for the wide receiver 2 spot in Pittsburgh. So I think I like that value a little bit more. And then you got Quincy Enunwa, who when healthy is a really nice PPR slot guy.
I mean, WR58, it's a fine price. It's essentially free. There are some nice options there. Curtis Samuel can be a game breaker. He's a speedster. In all of his statistics from last season, he finished outside the top 50 in everything pretty much across the board except touchdowns. The guy can get into the end zone. He's a game breaker. He finished with 5 touchdowns, making him WR31. So yeah, again, he's a late round. He's got upside, but he just cannot be relied upon, unlike the next guy on this team, DJ Moore. Now, a different script here. We thought he could be in line for their top wide receiver spot sooner than later. We liked his progression at Maryland, going from 25 receptions to 41 to 80 his senior year, finishing with 80 catches for over 1,000 yards and 8 scores with an almost 13 yards per reception rate. We had him ranked as WR63. He was not ranked by Mike Clay. He was actually going as WR51 in drafts, just behind Alan Hearns, just in front of Michael Gallup, and he finished WR36.
Yeah, in 12-team leagues, that's a wide receiver 3.
Solid. Okay, he played all 16 games. Again, love that. You gotta be on the field to score me points. And other than that, his statistics were fine, but really where he stood out was with his yards per reception. With a minimum of 40 catches, he was tied for WR16 with 14.3 yards per catch.
Yeah, beyond that, he had 82 targets, 55 catches, 788 yards, and 2 touchdowns. I think all that is not only sustainable, but certainly in line for an uptick when you consider the fact that Devin Funchess left 79 targets on the table after he departed to Indy. So DJ could definitely see, an increase in target share. His yards per carry of 14.3 certainly gets my attention. But, again, it all comes back to value. He's currently being drafted as wide receiver 27 overall. We are definitely taking a projection leap for a guy who finished as wide receiver 54 in fantasy points per game. He did finish as wide receiver 36 overall, but wide receiver 54 in points per game. So you've got guys going around him, Jay. 67 overall is where DJ's going as wide receiver 27. Tyler Boyd going right in front of him. Tyler Lockett going right behind him. I mean, I'll take both of those guys rock solid gladly over taking a shot about what DJ Moore might be.
I want to know that Cam's good to go. I want to know that shoulder is healthy and ready to rock. I like DJ Moore. I think he's good in that offense. That's an interesting group certainly to go in, and that will be a group definitely to dive into as we head into 2019.
Yes, sir. Moving on to another exciting wide receiving core in this division with the Atlanta Falcons. First up, we will start off with a surprising rookie who exploded onto the scene this season, Calvin Ridley. Coming into the season, it was notable to us that he was Brugler's wide receiver 1 in last year's draft guide. And even though he didn't show a lot in the preseason, we felt like he could be a productive receiver since he could cut it for Saban. And in 3 years at Alabama, he had 224 receptions, over 2,700 yards, 19 touchdowns, and 12.4 yards per carry, and what's pretty well known as a relatively vanilla type offense.
So we had him ranked as WR69 when nobody else really had him ranked heading into the season. Mike Clay did not have him in his preseason rankings, and he finished WR22. Do we at least get credit for having him ranked?
We get credit for having him ranked. We get credit for saying that despite the quiet preseason, we still were calling out things to like about him. And we were saying his wide receiver 48 price tag. Unfortunately, we were telling you we really like Keelan Cole in K-Bench, but we also talked about liking John Brown and Calvin Ridley at that price point as well. well. And finishing as wide receiver 22 overall and wide receiver 28 in points per game and playing all 16 games really gets your attention. 92 targets, 64 receptions, 821 yards receiving. And then he was tied for wide receiver 5 with 10 touchdowns, Jay. You want to talk about a red zone threat?
Yeah.
Yeah, he got in the end zone a lot this season.
Much was made about Julio and his lack of red zone production and getting into the end zone for a large part of the beginning of last season. And the reason why, Mr. Ridley over there was the guy snagging those balls.
But man, let me ask you this.
Yeah.
Right now, 51 overall, wide receiver 21, going right behind Robert Woods and Kenny Galladay, right in front of Jarvis Landry and Chris Godwin.
God,
I'm sorry.
Group.
I like Calvin Ridley. I expect this offense overall to have a little bit of a down year statistically compared to this past year as they adjust yet again to a new offensive system. And every time they've done that, each of the last 2 times, they've had a 1-year adjustment period.
Yep.
So I expect the same thing to occur again. It's just going to be a little bit of a fantasy impact. And where you're telling me that a rookie who finishes wide receiver 22 is going as wide receiver 21 the next season. I'm not into really that projection game as much when you got Robert Woods and Kenny Galladay going right there.
Well, I love the fact that Woods is staying healthy and you've seen what he can do. Kenny Galladay is an emergent talent also. And listen, I'm going to die on the Lando Hill. That's where you'll find my body. So,
and I love Lando and my Browns too. I'm right there with you, man. And Chris Godwin too, man. Like
I know.
He's
Okay, but then you look at this offense, Ben, and we talked about the possible production decline. Even if they're still a good offense, they can still be a great offense and still dip a little bit. But you also have Mohamed Sanu, who had 838 yards last season to Calvin Ridley's 821. Mohamed Sanu was a great kind of just safe WR3 player in fantasy land. He was free heading into the season. We thought his upside was limited, which is true, but we called him as a nice bye-week streamer option, and that was about it. And that's exactly what he was. We had him ranked as WR37. He finished WR31, but again, that is a rock-solid WR3. He had 838 yards on 66 catches, 94 targets, and 4 scores, and you compare that to Calvin Ridley, and he really wasn't too far off. He had more catches, more yards, more targets. He just lost the touchdown battle, which is what lost him the fantasy edge. But really, they were very similar complementary players to Julio Jones.
And just like last year, Mohamed Sanu is free right now in way too early ADPs. And he, to me, is in that similar boat to Austin Hooper, where I think both of their roles as more of a possession type of guy, I think that's going to be there. I think when offenses are limited, it's the guys who are responsible for those big explosive plays that turn into 10 touchdowns for Ridley or 8 touchdowns for Julio that really can take a hit and take a dip in a down year where an offense isn't clicking on all cylinders.
I'm shocked he's going free.
Yeah, but for steady Eddie guys like Mohamed Sanu and Austin Hooper, their value's still going to be there, and both are very, very underpriced going into drafts next season. So that'll be a fun one to watch for. And real quick, I just want to take a brief moment to touch on draft strategy. This is a prime example of why wide receiver, once you get outside the elite guys, is one that is the position that you can probably wait on the most, because there's guys like Mohamed Sanu all over the place that are going to finish in the wide receiver 30s that are almost or absolutely free in drafts.
Yeah, absolutely. Well said. All right, let's move on to the marquee player at the wide receiver position in the Falcons offense, Julio Jones. All right, we thought increased touchdowns had to be in line for a guy who was still WR7 overall and 10th in fantasy points per game, despite having only 3 touchdowns in 2017. Though admitting uneasiness, and a lot of that had to do with health, and he always seems like he's playing with a bad wheel. We had him ranked as WR6 heading into the season. Comparison, Mike Clay had him WR2. He finished right in the middle, WR4. Ben, listen to this stat line, my friend. He was WR5 in points per game game. He played all 16 games last year. Key. He was WR1 in targets with 170 targets. WR3 in catches with 113. WR1 in yards, 1,677 yards for Julio.
Wow.
And again, he had a little bit of a lapse in the scoring department. He was WR11, still a WR1, more than 3 touchdowns the previous year, but he finished with 8 scores on the year.
Yeah, and everybody was freaking out about the amount of touchdowns this guy had. And I know for a lot of the season, he had a very low amount. But overall, like we said, we knew 3 was the anomaly. And even in what people complained about was a down year, he still had 8. And next year, I think it's very possible for Julio to still have 8 touchdowns. And he might be one where, even though he might not have as many receiving yards because of a little bit of a lack of explosive offense, he might catch a couple more touchdowns and that could even out. He's currently going as wide receiver 312 overall, behind only DeAndre Hopkins and Devontae Adams. And right behind him is Michael Thomas and Odell Beckham.
You know what? What I'm going to be excited for when we preview this core heading into the 2019 season is your thoughts on, I know there's sentiment out there that Calvin Ridley could begin to eat into the share with Julio Jones, kind of like Juju and AB in Pittsburgh, kind of the beginning of the passing of the torch. So look, the sentiment is out there, and I'm going to be curious to get your thoughts on what you expect in 2019.
Well, here's what I expect. If you take Calvin Ridley's yards, 821, multiply it by 2, it's still a few yards less than what Julio did last year. Calvin Ridley has a long way to go before he starts getting mentioned in the same breath as Julio Jones. That's how I feel about that.
All right. Then it's not quite time.
Nope.
Line.
Nope.
Right,
not yet, my friend. Not yet. Now, that being said, DeAndre Hopkins all day. Devontae Adams all day. Michael Thomas all day. Odell with Baker May and Cleveland all day. This year in this offense at that price tag, I'm probably passing on Julio only because of my uncertainty of what this offense is going to look like. And while I know he's going to be a wide receiver 1 next season, I don't know if he's going to be wide receiver 3 next season.
Yeah, good point, and that's fair. All right, let's move on to a very interesting wide receiving group, and that is the Tampa Bay Bucks. Now, I don't even know where to begin with this offense.
Well, let me help you out. First, number 1, this fantasy football wide receiving core produced a wide receiver 2, a fringe wide receiver 2-3, a flex wide receiver in Deshaun Jackson, and a wide receiver 1 in Mike Evans. It's crazy to me that they all perform as well as they do with Jameis as their quarterback. And the volume is crazy. The consistency just isn't there with Jameis. So first up, let's start off with Adam Humphries. He is no longer on the team. He's now in Tennessee. He leaves 105 targets behind. He's short route possession type receiver, and he should fit in perfectly with that blah passing game over in Tennessee.
Yep.
But he finishes wide receiver 24 and wide receiver 33 in points per game. He was undrafted coming into the season, and he was a very relevant player. 105 targets, 76 catches, 816 yards, 5 touchdowns, and 10.7 yards per reception. Right now, he's going as wide receiver 61 behind Enunwa and DT and right in front of A.J. Brown and Marquise Brown. I mean, I don't have any problem with that price, but I'm not getting excited about him. He's very much to me like a Mohamed Sanu type, and their numbers are very similar, and their value to me is very similar with when it's pretty 171 versus undrafted, pretty much the same thing. And then you look at Deshaun Jackson, now back in Philly, leaves 74 targets behind. Now he had minimum 40 receptions last season, Jay. He was wide receiver 1 in yards per reception with 18.9. He's still got it. The only question is health, usage, and target share. And we'll talk about him more going into next season, but he finishes wide receiver 42 playing 12 games, and he was wide receiver 30 in fantasy points per game. So when he played, he was a very relevant week-to-week starter. And, it'll be interesting to see what he does over there with Carson Wentz or whoever's backing up Carson Wentz because he's not playing, and we'll go from there. The story in this wide receiving core going into 2019 comes down to two guys, Chris Godwin and Mike Evans.
Verbatim preseason notes, Ben, on Chris Godwin. He's their WR2, and they're not being shy about it. He averaged 15.4 yards per reception last year with Tampa Bay. The last 2 years at Penn State, he averaged over 1,000 yards and 16 yards per reception. The point being, his play capability shouldn't be overlooked. It seems consistent. Okay, now, we did not have him ranked. Mike Clay did not have him ranked. He was going as WR 56, 136 to 141 overall in drafts. Where did he finish?
Wide receiver 27 overall and tied for wide receiver 35 in fantasy points per game. And what do we always love? He played all 16 games, 95 targets, 59 receptions, 842 yards, tied for wide receiver 13 with 7 touchdowns, and tied for wide receiver 16 with 14.3 yards per reception, minimum 40 receptions. So, like Jay said, our notes coming into the preseason is that his big play capability seems consistent and should not be overlooked. 15.4 yards per reception last year with Tampa Bay in 2017. 16 yards per reception in 2 years in Penn State. Last year, 14.3 yards per reception as the wide receiver 2. Now coming into his second year under Bruce Arians, I mean, the only concern I have for this guy going forward is Jameis.
Well, that's it. You mentioned it before. There are 179 vacated targets to be redirected and to be divvied up amongst this offense. So you got to think, look, Chris Godwin is one of the premier up-and-coming young receivers. We just talked about Calvin Ridley. You've got Babytron in Detroit.
Yeah, Kenny Galladay.
Kenny Galladay in Detroit. This is the next young wave of talented wide receivers. So you got to think he takes a step forward. The target share is there for him to take a step forward.
And that's it. And that's it. That's the difference with Chris Godwin, unlike anybody else that you just mentioned. When you talk about the total combined targets between Adam Humphries and Deshaun Jackson leaving town, and you talk about, we haven't got into it yet, that Mike Evans had 139 targets as wide receiver 10. Even if Mike Evans' targets goes up like 40, I mean, Chris Godwin's could pretty much double from like 95 right there to a 1A, 1B situation as far as target share goes between Mike Evans and Chris Godwin.
Well, let's get into Mike Evans. We called him a low-end WR1 with elite upside. We knew his quarterback situation was a concern, which we have discussed continuously. Ben, real quick, let's highlight that. You discussed the wide receiving core on this offense. They had a wide receiver 1, a wide receiver 2, and a wide receiver 3, and then a flex wide receiver, all on this offense in the fantasy world. And yet, what could they muster from the quarterback position? A QB 22 and a QB 28. That's the quarterback situation on this team.
I don't even understand how that is mathematically possible. How do you get 2 quarterbacks so bad and 4 wide receivers so good? Like, it does not make logical sense to me. I don't understand.
I know.
And I mean, we had Mike Evans as wide receiver 14 coming into the season. Mike Clay had him as wide receiver 9. Kudos to Mike Clay. He hit the nail on the head. He finished as wide receiver 9 and wide receiver 10 in overall points per game.
Okay, and then you look at the rest of his stats. He played all 16 games. Fantastic. Love it. He was WR10 in targets, WR11 in receptions, WR3 in receiving yards, WR11 in receiving touchdowns. So you look across the board, and he was exactly what we called him. A low-end WR1 with elite upside, period.
And part of that elite upside comes in the fact that he was wide receiver 3 in yards per reception with 17.7. Now that's minimum 40 receptions. And right now in way too early ADPs, he is going 19 overall as wide receiver 7 behind OBJ, Juju, and in front of Antonio Brown and Adam Thielen. That's a very interesting group. I really like a lot of guys there. I mean, I don't have a problem with Mike Evans' price tag. No. I don't think it's a max value type of pick, but he 17.7 yards per catch if that offense and that quarterback situation gets right, he could very easily best his 1,500 yards receiving that he had last year and be wide receiver 1 overall.
The guy was a star in college bailing out Johnny Football. The guy has been a star at the pro level bailing out crab legs. So that can continue for the foreseeable future, and he can be an elite wide receiver. I've got no issues with where he's going in drafts. There are question marks with some of the guys going behind him. So I have no problem with his value. The guy's been great, and even if Chris Godwin starts to emerge a little bit more, there's plenty of target share in this offense for him to continue to be elite.
Yeah, because like we said, part of those 179 vacated targets are going to go to Mike Evans as well.
Right.
So that wide receiver 10 and 139 targets, it could definitely go up. And again, you got to just touch on the catch rate. He had 86 catches compared to 139 targets. That's a really, I do not think that's a very good pass catching rate. I would have to check that out. And I attribute that mostly to the quarterback, not to the receiver. So target share goes up. If quarterback play improves whatsoever, man, Mike Evans could definitely have an elite wide receiver one.
I can tell you that Jameis's accuracy rate was QB21 at 64.6%. So that is a cause for that.
Yeah, that'll do it for sure. Accuracy is not a concern for the wide receivers in our next team. We've got the New Orleans Saints receivers catching passes from Drew Brees. You know, real quick, we're going to gloss over Cam Meredith, Traquan Smith, and Ted Ginn. You know, we were hoping that Cam Meredith could finally stay healthy. We'd love to see it. It didn't happen. He played in 6 games. He had 9 catches on the season. Traquan Smith flashed at times. He had a couple of nice little spot duty starts on the season, finished with 15.2 yards per reception and 5 touchdowns, you know, had less than 450 receiving yards and less than 30 catches. So again, not really fantasy relevant. Another guy not being drafted so far going forward in 2019. We love Teddy Ginn coming into the season. We love that he was free. He was our wide receiver 42, and he finished as wide receiver 46 overall in points per game, only playing 5 games. So we actually nailed that pretty well. And he's going undrafted. I mean, these guys, I'm sure we're going to be talking about different pass catchers in this offense on our preview pods going into 2019, aside from. Yeah, me too. If not, we know one guy that's not going to change, and we know one guy that we can count on, and that's Michael Thomas.
I am so glad that we are ending our preview podcast with a Buckeye on this list and a stud at the wide receiver position, and that is Michael Thomas. All he's ever done heading into 2018 was finish as WR6 and WR7. So coming into the 2018 season, we liked his WR5 price. It was fine, and thought the sky's the limit in 2018 and beyond. We had him ranked at Total Foresight as WR5. Mike Clay had him as WR6. Ding, ding, ding. Mike Clay nailed it again. We weren't off by too much. He finished as WR6 overall and WR6 in points per game. So really nailed that one. Love seeing that. And again, we have another stud playing all 16 games. I can't underscore how valuable that is. The reliability. He was WR9 in targets with 147. WR1 overall in receptions. 125 receptions, 85% catch rate.
That's all Drew Brees' accuracy.
Yes.
QB1 in the NFL in accuracy.
And that is the difference, my friend. We just talked about it with Mike Evans. Michael Thomas is the exact flip side of that. And then he finished WR8 in receiving touchdowns with 9. I mean, I'm sorry, and I missed WR6, 1,400 yards.
Yeah, 1,400 receiving yards is WR6, and 9 touchdowns tied for WR8. I mean, he had 11.2 yards per reception, but when you have 125 receptions, you can have a, quote, lower double-digit yard per reception catch rate.
They're trying to get the ball in his hands quickly, and it worked, and he's a WR1 all day long.
Yeah, I mean... Yeah, I was going to say, you can trust him to be there. There's still not a wide receiver of note on this team. Alvin Kamara is the next best pass catcher on the offense. Then you probably got Jared Cook. Other than that, all the targets are going to be going to Michael Thomas. He's going as wide receiver 4, 13 overall. He's going behind Devontae Adams, Julio Jones, in front of Odell Beckham and Juju.
Yeah, I mean, at this time, all you have then is Traquan Smith, who could become, a WR3? So the lion's share is still going to Michael Thomas and to Alvin Kamara. And, at WR4, I can't argue with that price.
Yeah, again, I don't know that it's one of those max value guys that you're going to target, but, a completely safe pick, even at wide receiver 4, I would say. And yeah, the sky's the limit for this kid. All he's ever been since he's stepped on the football field in the NFL has been a wide receiver 1.
Hey, man, we did it. We got through the 2018 review podcast. We broke down every division, every position. We went through, we saw where we got it right, where we got it wrong. We tried to figure out why that was. There were definitely lessons we learned, trends that we uncovered, and we will use all that information as we prepare for the 2019 season, and I can't wait to kick it off with analyzing this year's draft.
I completely agree with you, and we want everybody to know that Jay and I really try and take this approach from what we as fantasy football players and fans desire, and we try to bring you no fluff, nothing but nonstop, fast-paced fantasy football content. We try and give you a 360 review of everybody. We try and give you nothing but the content that you're looking for. You're coming to listen to us talk about nothing else but fantasy football, and we hope you enjoy it.
All right.
Well, you know what, Jay? I really can't wait for the upcoming podcast schedule that we have. We've got a couple of surprise topic podcasts before we really start diving into our preparation for the 2019 preview episodes. But coming up next, like you said, we're going to be going over all the fantasy football relevant NFL draft picks that are going to make an impact on your 2019 fantasy football season. Can't wait.
And that wraps up this episode of Fantasy Foresight, the podcast. We thank you for joining us. Be sure to visit us, as always, at fantasyforesight.com. Use the links at the bottom of the page to find us across social media, including Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, and wherever you pod. We hope you enjoyed the episode, and we'll see you next time.